Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the area of Microsoft 365 development. And I have a lot of experience with SharePoint development, including all of the different development models that we've had, Microsoft Graph development, Microsoft Teams development, and developing add-ins for Microsoft Office, as well as working with Microsoft Identity, including Azure AD. Microsoft Identity Platform is an evolution of the Azure Active Directory developer platform. It allows developers to build applications that sign in users and access resources in both external applications such as Microsoft Office 365, the Azure portal, and thousands of other SaaS applications and internal resources such as apps on your corporate network and intranet, along with any cloud apps developed by your own organization. In this module, you'll learn the basics of Microsoft Identity, including the different types of tokens, account types, and supported topologies. In this first section, we're going to do an overview of Microsoft Identity Platform, and we'll explore identity tokens, or ID tokens, and access tokens. In today's world, physically protected networks aren't as common as they once were. Even your on-premises networks aren't as secure as you think they are. The configuration of today's networks are driven by the needs of users and businesses that has changed over time. Organizations can't assume users will be in one place. Rather, they are on both internal and external networks. Users don't access networks with one device either. They have a myriad of devices and types of software architectures that they use, including on-premises apps, SaaS apps, mobile apps, and so on. How are you as a developer supposed to properly secure your applications and your users' access to information across so many scenarios? The answer is to use an identity provider as your control plane. By using your identity provider, your application and the organization can decide who gets access to what, when they get to do it, and how they got to do it. Access and control are important as well, as that they have the level of sophistication available to them. It might be okay if somebody is working on sensitive financial information when they are on the company network at the office. However, it might not be okay for them to access that information from an internet cafe on the other side of the world where the organization is unaware of the user's environment. The idea that your identity provider can help you provides the right control plane for your application. The identity provider is where the users, resources, and policies intersect within your organization. To a developer, you want your application to be as accessible to the highest number of users who should have access to it. Independent software vendors, or ISVs, are especially interested in the greatest reach in order to grow their business. You also need access to those resources the users need access to, including mail, information about me. Access to these resources is important in building valuable solutions for your customers. A problem you need to address is how will all these users access their resources, but in a way that complies with whatever policies and security requirements the enterprise demands. How do you make sure that your application follows the right policies? Each enterprise will have a different point of view on what the policy should be. This is where an identity platform is here to help. The goal of the Microsoft Identity Platform is to make it easy for you to access the largest number of users and the most valuable amount of information in a secure way that satisfies the policies of those enterprises. Let's look at how Microsoft Identity approaches users, resources, and policies. Microsoft Identity includes 3 solutions for addressing the largest number of users. Microsoft is one of the largest identity providers. Azure Active Directory manages over 1 billion identities and billions of authentications every day. Over 20 million organizations, including most Fortune 500 companies, use Azure Active Directory. Microsoft Identity provides 2 additional solutions for partners and providers and customers. Azure AD Business to Business, or B2B, enables an organization in an Azure AD to securely share files and resources with another organization in Azure AD. Azure AD Business to Customer, or B2C, enables an organization to provide customer-facing apps that enable users to sign in with an identity that they already have, such as a Microsoft account, a Gmail account, Facebook or Twitter account, or create an account for the solution. Now, Microsoft Graph is the gateway for all of your data in the Microsoft Cloud, from Office 365, Enterprise Mobility and Security, to Windows 10. Microsoft Graph enables developers to build applications that can provide users access to their data, and developers and users can access their data with Microsoft Graph by authenticating and authorizing users with Microsoft Identity. The third element of identity is policies. Policies have become complicated with users accessing resources from different networks and devices. The threat matrix, depending on how a user is accessing a resource, is quite complex. Various combinations of different users using different devices pose different risks to the organization. Microsoft Identity is built to support this complex and dynamic threat matrix. One policy can be applied when a user is on a trusted corporate network using their corporate identity or their company-issued laptop, while another policy can apply to the same user when they have access to the same resource from home or on their personal tablet. By relying on Microsoft Identity to handle these complex policies, you don't have to implement the complex logic in your custom applications. Now, so far we've looked at what Microsoft Identity is from a high level, but as a developer, when you build an application, you will ultimately request tokens from Microsoft Identity to identify a user and to authorize them to use an application with specific permissions. Let's look at the different tokens that you're going to use. The first type of a token is an ID token that is made available via Microsoft Identity support for the OpenID Connect protocol. OpenID Connect extends the OAuth 2.0 authorization protocol to use as an authentication protocol. OpenID Connect enables you to implement single sign-on using OAuth in your applications. It introduces the concept of an ID token. An ID token is a security token that allows the client to verify the identity of the user. The ID token also gets basic profile information about the user. Because OpenID Connect extends OAuth 2.0, applications can securely acquire tokens, which can be used to access resources that are secured by an authorization server. The claims included within an ID token can then be used for the user experience within your application, such as keys in a database and providing access to a client application. ID tokens for Microsoft Identity are JSON Web Tokens, or JWTs, pronounced JOT. These ID tokens consist of a header, a payload, and a signature. The header and the signature are used to verify the authenticity of the token, while the payload contains the information about the user requested by your client. This slide is showing a list of all of the noteworthy claims that are included within an ID token that you can take advantage of as a developer within your application. Now, it is important for developers, whenever possible, to use a well-maintained OpenID Connect library. And while Microsoft Identity is built on open standards like OAuth 2 and the OpenID Connect, fully implementing these protocols is time-consuming and complicated. It is also required that any implementation of these standards be kept up to date with the latest recommendations to ensure the implementation is as secure as possible. When your web app needs to authenticate the user, it can direct the user to the Microsoft Identity Platform /authorize endpoint using the OpenID Connect library. Now, at this point, the user is going to be prompted to enter their credentials, enter a multi-factor auth, use a FIDO2 compatible device, or perhaps use a passwordless experience using Microsoft Authenticator or Windows Hello to complete the authentication. All of these options are handled by the platform without any additional code for the developer. The Microsoft Identity Platform endpoint verifies that the user has consented to the permissions indicated in the scope parameter. If the user hasn't consented to any of these permissions, the Microsoft Identity Platform endpoint prompts the user to consent to the required permissions. And you can read more about these permissions, consent, and multi-tenant apps. After the user authenticates and grants consent, the Microsoft Identity Platform endpoint returns a response to your app at the indicated redirect URI. Now, many web apps not only need to sign a user in, but they also need access to a web service on behalf of the user by using OAuth. And this scenario combines the OpenID Connect for user authentication while simultaneously getting an authorization code that you can use to get access tokens if you are using the OAuth authorization code flow. Applications request access to tokens from Microsoft Identity to use when calling a web service. Access tokens enable clients to securely call APIs protected by Azure AD. Applications should never inspect or validate an access token. Access tokens must only be passed to the API. Access tokens are created based on the audience of the token, meaning that the API that owns the scopes in the token. To acquire an access token, use your OpenID Connect or OAuth 2 library. For an example with MSAL, you're going to always use this pattern. First, you acquire the access token silently, and if MSAL has a token cached or can silently refresh the token, it will do so. By including the permission scopes in the request, the Microsoft Identity Platform endpoint ensures that the user has consented to the permission indicated in the scope query parameter. If MSAL cannot acquire the token silently, it will through a UI required exception. It will notify the user through a UI required exception. If this happens, the developer should request access to the token interactively. This could happen if consent for the permissions has not been granted, the user has not yet authenticated, or perhaps the user is using an unmanaged device to access sensitive data from a location where the user has never been before and MFA is required. Your application may receive tokens on behalf of a user or directly from an application as if there is an automated service or daemon application. These app-only tokens indicate that the call is coming from an application and does not have a user backing it. These tokens are handled largely by the same as the user tokens, with a few subtle differences. In this first demonstration, we're going to take an Azure AD application that we've created to use within a single page application, a fully 100% client-side HTML and JavaScript based app. And we're going to configure it, the single page app, to use the Azure AD application so a user can sign in and display their information coming from the Microsoft Graph on the single page application. So the first thing that we've done, if I come over here and take a look at my browser, I've logged into the Azure AD administration portal, and I'm going to go to the Azure AD Admin Center and select my app registrations. And so the app that I've created here is called Hello World Identity. So if I open this guy up, we'll see he's got an application ID and a directory ID. We're going to need both of those in just a minute. But the other thing I want you to take notice of here is if I come over here to my redirect URIs. Now if I select this, and if I scroll down here to the bottom, what you're going to see here is the supported account types is a single tenant application. Now what that means, again, that means that my application is only going to allow users from the directory where the application is registered to sign in. So if this app was registered in the Contoso organization, only my Contoso users would be able to sign in with this. Users from Fabricam or some other identity would not be able to sign in and use this application. Now, another thing that we've set up here for use within our application, and specifically for as a single page application, is down here under the implicit grant. And what I've done here is I've turned on access tokens and ID tokens. And what this does is that the implicit grant is a specific OAuth 2 flow, authentication flow that you have to enable. You have to turn this on. This one does not require us to use a client secret or any kind of a certificate. It just requires the client ID. So it doesn't have a server-side based component to it as well. Now, we've got our application. Let's go back over here to our VS Code, and let's take a look at our single page app. So our single page app here, what this is just going through and loading in a couple different libraries. So it's loading in the Microsoft Authentication library, and it's also loading in this library called Bluebird, and that's just used to make it easier to work with JavaScript promises. Now, we're going to simply have a welcome message, and we'll change the value of that based on if the user is signed in. And then we'll have this sign in button as well, and we'll change the value of that depending if they're signed in, if they want to sign out. And then we're going to write out the data that comes back as well. Now, what I'm doing here in the JavaScript, or let me actually jump down a little bit farther here. Let me show you another function before we get started. So I've got this function here called init page, and this is going to run when the current page loads. What this is doing is this is checking to see what browser you're using, because if you're using Internet Explorer, there are some known issues with Internet Explorer where it does not like using a pop-up for the login, and instead it's going to redirect you. And so all we're doing is we're doing a check to see if you're currently IE, which I guess that code is right. It's a little bit farther above, but it's checking to see if you're using Internet Explorer. Then we want to make sure that we change this to being a redirect instead of it being a just a standard refresh or using a pop-up instead. And that's where the pop-up is right down here. Okay, so that's just a little utility thing I wanted to highlight here. So let's scroll up a little bit and let's take a look at the code for this. So the first bit of code here is going to configure our application. And so you see here I've got my MSAL config, and we need to pass it some information about the Azure AD application. For example, what the authority is and what the client ID is. So the authority is the URL, which tenant can be used to authenticate with this application. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my directory ID. So let's go back over here to our app, and I'm going to grab the directory ID and come back over here and paste that in right here. And then I also need my client ID as well, which is also known as the application ID. So I'll grab that from right here, come back over here to our application, and I will set that value as well. Okay, now I'm also setting up the cache. So I'm saying I want to be able to have a session cache or a token cache. I do want to be able to use a token cache, and the token cache location is going to be stored in the browser's local storage object. Then I've got a little bit of configuration stuff here for Microsoft Graph that I'm going to use a little bit later. Now, once that's done, I'm going to create an instance of my MSAL application. So I have my application right here where I've created a new instance of a user agent application, passing in the config, and then I'm calling the handle redirect callback. So this says once the user has gone and logged in, well, this is checking to see this right now. So the handle redirect callback is looking at the URL on the page and saying, is this a redirect from Azure AD? If it is, we need to handle it. If it's not, then this doesn't do anything right now, okay? Because what happens is during the authentication, once I've successfully authenticated, Azure AD is going to redirect the user from Azure AD sign-in back over to my application. And so when it does that, and it's going to do that also by sending it back to this URI that I have listed right here, when it goes through and it redirects us back, it's going to need to pull out all the values off the URL for the access token and ID token that we're going to need. So here the sign-in button, what happens when I click the sign-in button? That's going to call the sign-in function. That is going to open up the login. We're going to go ahead and log in. It's going to use the request object here. It's going to say that it's going to pass in the scopes, so what permissions are being requested. And then when it gets the response back, it'll update the UI and acquire the token it'll acquire the token and go get the user data. So let's see what that does. So update the user interface. Let's go find that method. That is right here. So what this does is this is simply saying, grabbing a reference to our div and our the welcome message here. So it's simply saying that we're going to grab a reference to this and say welcome, and it's going to list out the person's name right here if they've already signed in. So you can see here I'm going to the MSAL app, get the account, and then get their username, and I'm going to write that on the screen. This is only happening, remember, if they've signed in. I'm also going to change the sign in button to sign out and change his on click event to sign out. Now then I said acquire token, pop up, and get user. So what does this code do? So what this code is doing is this code is going to say go acquire the token silently. And what that does is that tries to get the token out of the token cache for the specified endpoint for the current user with the appropriate scope. And if it doesn't find that, if it finds that token in the token cache and that token is still valid, in other words, it has not expired, then I'm going to take that token that we're going to get back here in this then statement, and I'm going to use that to call a method called getUserFromMicrosoft Graph. And that code is going to go to the Microsoft Graph endpoint using this access token and telling it what function to call, which you see up there on line 70, what function to call when we get the data back. Okay, so we're not gonna dive into this. You can look at this on your own time. That's just a call to Microsoft Graph, the Microsoft Graph API, which is a bit beyond the scope of what we're trying to do in this demo. But let's say that fails. So let's say acquire token silent fails. So what that means is it can mean a couple different things, but it may mean that the token is expired. It may mean that it didn't find a matching token for the same endpoint for the same user with the same scopes. It may also mean that that it simply just failed to get the token, that it didn't exist. So if any of those things happen, what you're going to see here is it's then going to come over here and it's going to write the error out, and then I have a function here called requires interaction. What this is going to do, let's see if we can find that code real quick. Here we go. So when we get that, it's going to check to see if it's one of these different errors here. Okay, it's either going to be consent required, which means that the permission that's being asked for, the scope that's being asked for, while you have an access token, it doesn't have that same scope, and the user has not granted consent to the Azure AD application with that scope. And so consent is required, which means we need an interaction with the user. They need to go through and grant consent. We can't get this thing silently. The other one is interaction required. Well, similar to what we just did. Maybe the user has to sign in, and maybe it's expired and we don't have a refresh token, or maybe some other thing happened. Whatever it is, it requires interaction. And so they're going to have to come to Azure AD to go log in. The other error is, well, maybe they're not even signed in, and so they have to log in. And so that's the other one that comes up. So regardless of any of those things that come back, let's see, where are we? We were right, I believe we were right here. So you can see here where it requires interaction. What this is going to do is that if it's any of those cases, it's going to fire off the acquire token pop-up, and then it's going to go do this. So you see the difference here, acquire token silent and acquire pop-up. So what this one's doing is trying to get the token from the token cache. And if it fails for whatever reason, if it requires interaction, then we're going to use the pop-up to go launch it. And we're using instead this method if we said that we wanted to do redirects because they're in Internet Explorer. All right, and that's basically it. So now to get this guy to run, we need to start up a web server to host this web application and then give it a shot. So let's come over here to our to the console, and in the console, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an npm start, because what we've done in our application, I'll show you this while it's spinning up. What we've done in our application is we've created a little Node.js web server, and all this Node.js web server does is it's going to load the index.html, which is just going to load up a little web server and load up our index.html page. Right? So our application is now running on port 3007. So let's come over here to HTTP localhost 3007. All right, there we go. So there is our application. So now we're not signed in, so I'm going to go ahead and click sign in. So here it launched the pop-up because I'm not using Internet Explorer. Now I'm already signed in because I was logged into Azure AD. So I'm already signed in, and what it's doing is it's saying, hey, you've never used this application before. And it's because you've never used this application before, you have to consent this application to give it permissions to do the things of the permissions that it's requesting. And in this case here, my application is requesting to sign in and get access to data of my information. And so I can click accept. Now again, if I had not been logged in already, which in this case I was, but if I was not logged in already, I would have been prompted to authenticate. So here I'll go ahead and click accept. What Azure AD has done behind the scenes is it has authenticated me. You saw that already, I was already authenticated. It prompted me for consent to grant that application that we had created, the hello world identity, grant it the user.read permission scope. I needed to grant it that to on my identity, my user account, so it could get my information. And then I had to go through and set the rest of the stuff on the and then it went through and it authenticated the user and it redirected them back to my web app, and my web app was able to grab that information off of the redirect and fetch an access token, use that access token to call Microsoft Graph and get my data. So pretty cool. And then click sign out and it will sign me out. Now I can come back over. If I came back to my application because I'm already signed out, now you can see what the action looks like when I go to sign in. You can see here I'm not signed in, so now I have to go sign in. So I'll grab my password. And then it signed me in. It already saw that I had consented to the application, and so it just generated the token and sent it back over to my application, which it was able to use that token, the ID token, to then go fetch an access token and use that access token to call Microsoft Graph. So in this demo, you saw how to use a single page application in an Azure AD app to obtain an access token and call Microsoft Graph. In this section, we're going to look at the different account types that are used within Microsoft Identity Platform. And you're also going to learn about the differences and relationships between applications and service principals. Specifically, we're going to look at a single organization, a multiple organization, as well as how to use Microsoft accounts. And finally, we're going to look at the differences between applications and service principals. Developers that leverage Microsoft Identity within a custom app begin with registering an application in Azure AD. Now, it doesn't matter if the app runs on a mobile device or in the cloud or whatever cloud provider it runs on. The app can even be a PowerShell script. The Azure AD application is the control point for how you access the identity and the information that it protects. You as the developer have a number of choices to make, and the choices you make are driven by the requirements for your application. Developers have to decide the following things. How will customers get the app? Should the app do work on behalf of the user or as the app itself? What resources are required by the app and when are they needed? And finally, when should the app ask the user for permissions to a resource? The first decision is, are you going to trust the Microsoft Identity Platform? Now, once you've made that decision to trust the Microsoft Identity Platform, the next step is to register an app with Azure AD. The key part of creating an Azure AD application is what are the permissions the app requires. Another key decision that you're going to make when registering the app is what type of accounts is it going to support. The Microsoft Identity Platform supports the following types of accounts: single organization, multiple organizations, and personal Microsoft accounts. Now, if you're writing a line of business application or an LOB app, you can sign in users using from your own organization. Applications that sign in users only from the app's home tenant are called single tenant applications. Now, administrators can decide who can register applications in the tenant. These could be every user, only administrators, or users with the application administrator, cloud application administrator, or application developer Azure AD administrator roles. These users within your organization can sign in and use the application. No one outside the organization can use this application in a single tenant instance. The other type of application is one that allows users from more than just your organization to sign in and use the application. For example, if you're an independent software vendor, you can write an application which signs in users from any organization. These applications can also allow users to sign in using their personal Microsoft account. Maybe you want to give users the choice of signing into an application using either their work and school account or their personal account. These are called multi-tenant applications. Building great multi-tenant apps can be a challenge because of the number of different policies that IT administrators can set in their tenants. So when building a multi-tenant app, you should keep a few guidelines in mind. First, test your app in a tenant that has configured conditional access policies. The conditional access feature in Azure AD offers one of the several ways that IT pros can use to secure your app and protect a service. Conditional access enables enterprise customers to protect services in multiple ways, including multi-factor authentication, allowing only Intune enrolled devices to access specific services, and restricting user locations and IP ranges. Your application may, or may not, acquire access tokens due to various conditional access policies. Your app must gracefully handle not obtaining an access token. Your apps should also follow the principle of least user access to ensure that your app only requests permissions it actually needs. Avoid requesting permissions that require admin consent, as this may prevent users from acquiring your app at all in some organizations. And then finally, provide appropriate names and descriptions for any permissions that you expose as part of your app. This helps users and admins know what they are agreeing to when they are attempting to use your app's APIs. Now, an application that has been integrated with Azure AD has implications that go way beyond the software aspect. Application, I put that in quotes, is a frequently used as a conceptual term, referring not only to the application software, but also its Azure AD registration and role in the authentication and authorization, quote, conversations at runtime. So when you register an Azure AD application in the Azure portal, there are really two objects that are created in your Azure tenant. One is an application object and one is a service principal. Let's talk about the differences in these. The application object is where developers specify how the app works, and this includes the parameters for authentication, secrets, or certificates, and what permissions the app will use, and any APIs the app may expose. Azure AD applications are defined by exactly one application object. The application object resides in the Azure AD tenant where it was registered, its home tenant. Now, a service principal is different. IT pros can use the service principal object to determine how the application operates within their tenant. The IT pro can limit the app to specific users and/or groups, review permissions and grant consent, assign users and/or groups to roles, or configure the app provisioning. For a multi-tenant application, when an application is given permission to access resources within a tenant, a service principal object is created within that tenant. So consider an application object as the global representation of your application for use across all tenants. And the service principal, you can think of that as the local representation for use within a specific tenant. Application objects have a one-to-one relationship with the software application and a one-to-many relationship with its corresponding service principal objects. Service principals must be created in each tenant where the application is used, enabling it to establish an identity for a sign-in and/or access to resources being secured by the tenant. Single-tenant application has only one service principal in its home tenant, created and consented for use during application registration. Multi-tenant web applications, or APIs, also have a service principal created in each tenant where a user from that tenant has consented to its use. In this second demo, we're going to look at how different account types can be used within the Microsoft Identity Platform. So this one, what we're going to do is we're going to sign into a web application using two different accounts. They're both work and school accounts, otherwise known as Azure AD accounts. But these two accounts are going to come from two different organizations. One is going to be from the organization where our application is going to live, our Azure AD application is going to be created. The other one is going to be, the other account is going to be coming from outside of our organization, like a different company or a partner. And I'm going to show you how the two different types of applications can be used to support both of these scenarios in the case of single tenant and multi-tenant. So what we're first going to do is I'm going to jump over here to the browser and let's take a look at an application we've created. So this one's called Hello World Identity 1. So what I did with this one, if I go ahead and look at his redirect URIs, if I scroll down to the bottom, I still want you to notice that we are using a single tenant. Again, just like our last demo, what this means is that only users who are inside of the same Azure AD directory where my application has been registered should be able to log into this application. We're going to prove that in just a minute. Now, the couple of things I did. This application that we're working with is an ASP.NET Core web application that's been set up for the single authentication or single organization authentication. And furthermore, we're using the OpenID Connect middleware that we have inside of the .NET ASP.NET Core. So what I've done here is I've added in a couple redirect URIs. I've added a redirect URI to our application running on localhost 3007 and the sign-in endpoint. So there's a sign-in-OIDC, so the OpenID Connect. I then also had to add under the advanced settings, I also had to set up a logout URL to be similar where it says sign out OIDC. And then finally, we also want to get ID tokens as well. Now, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go through and grab some information about this application because we're going to need to use this in the registration of our ASP.NET application. So if I come over here, this is my ASP.NET application. And I'm going to show you some of the changes I made to it, but I started out by just simply going .NET new MVC auth single org. And that created the application that you're going to see here, except I am going to walk through and show you the places where I've made some changes to the code. So that's all I did was .NET new MVC -- auth single org, right? That's all I did. This is a .NET Core 3.0 application. So the first thing we're going to do, if I come over here under my app settings, I need to go configure a few values here. I need to go through and tell the OpenID Connect, I need to configure it and say, what Azure AD application we're going to, where are we registering it, where are we logging in, etc. What's our callback path look like, all of that stuff. So I can get all of this stuff from Azure AD. So if I go back to my application and I grab the application ID and I'll paste that in. And then I'll grab the directory ID and I will also paste that in. And then my domain, I need to grab that for my org. So that, if I come over here to my organization, that is, I can use this URL right here. So I'll paste that in, Voitanos Dev on Microsoft.com. So all of that is set up correctly. Now the next thing I need to do is I need to update the web apps launch configuration, and that's going to be over here in the properties section. So I go into launch settings and make sure that everything is set up accordingly. So again, I'm using in my application IIS, I'm using the HTTP localhost 3000 and the SSL port is also on 3000. And then down here, the application URL is on 5000 for the secure one. So when I go to localhost 5001, that's really going to, under the covers, it's really going to 3007. All right, so that's all been set up. Now, what I want to do is I want to update the user experience once the user logs in. And so what I did is I came over here into views, I looked at the home index view, and all I did was I came in here and I modified and I added some of this code that you see listed right here. And so what this is doing is I'm checking to see if the current user is authenticated, and if they are, I want to write out an HTML table that simply is going to write out all of the claims that we have inside of the ID token that we got back from the end user. That's all I want to do. All right, so let's give this a shot. So I'm going to come over here to my console and do a .NET build, and we'll do followed by a .NET run. Okay, now our application is running and it's now listening on 2 different ports. So let's go ahead and jump to our application. And I was already logged in, so it didn't force me to log in here. But let's take a look at what this is doing. So remember that we create our application inside of the Voitanos Dev organization. And my user, I'm logged in as that same user, as Andrew Connell, Voitanos Dev on Microsoft.com. If you come down and you take a look at some of these claims, there's some interesting stuff here. So we can see that I'm actually getting some information back about the current user. So it's got my surname, my given name, and my full name as well. And then it's also got some information here about where I'm coming from. So it has my tenant ID. That is the directory. This is the directory that I was signed into, this C1AE. And we can see that if I come over here to one of our applications. So let's go to the app that we created. And we can see we are using that directory. We're getting signed in from this directory right here. Furthermore, we can also see some other claims about it. So like my name and my UPN, that's my unique identifier right here. So it's kind of interesting. I got a couple different things that are set up. But now let's see this. Let's see something different here. So remember, this is a single org application or a single tenant based application. I'm going to go ahead and sign out. And we're going to sign in as somebody from a completely different directory here, or completely different organization. So I'm going to come over here and say sign in. Now let's sign in with a totally different user. Now notice Megan B is coming from a totally different directory. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in using her username and password. Notice here, totally different directory. I'll paste her username in and password in as well. But this time I'm getting an error. And why am I getting an error? It's because this user is from a different identity provider. Notice that is not using the same directory that I have listed right here. It does not exist in my tenant, and it means it cannot use this application. So this user has been completely blocked. It's even telling me too, the user account needs to be added as an external user in the tenant first. And that's called B2B, right? So we can't do that right now. We're not doing that right now in this demo. But let me show you another way that we can do this. So another way that we can do this, let's go ahead and close this out. And let's come back over here. Let's close this application. And let's open up a different app that I've created. This one is for multi-org, right? Now the difference here is that when I created this one using the .NET SDK, this time that when I created it as a multi-org and not single org. So I need to go through and set these same settings here. So this one we need the application ID. So let's come back over to our browser and let's go to a different Azure AD app that I've created. So here I've created one. This is identity number 2. Let's grab this ID so we can update it. And I don't need to specify anything else. Notice here, the instance. I don't have a directory. I don't have a tenant. I don't have any of that stuff listed because I don't care where they come from. This common endpoint is basically telling Azure AD, you figure out where that user is coming from and let them sign in. We allow anybody to sign into our application. And how do I do that? Well, inside of the app, if I look at the redirect URI, everything is the exact same as the first one except this last setting here. I've set it for multi-tenant, which means any Azure AD directory can sign in. So let's go back over to our code. Let's make sure that our launch settings are all set up, which they are set up the same way, so we're good there. And I also set up the same setting with the claims as well. So let's now take our application and let's do a .NET build. And then we'll do a .NET run. There we go, application's running again. So let's try this out. So now, coming into the application, it's gonna let me sign in with anybody. Now I can come in, I'm gonna sign in with my old user account that I had a minute ago. Let's grab that password. This is the one that where I'm logged in into the same directory as where the application was registered. So notice here, I'm logged in using the directory C1AE, okay? But if I switch out, if I sign out and sign in as Megan, Megan's coming from a totally different directory. And if I sign in as Megan, which it remembers, so I'm going to use that same account, I just got to put the password back in. Notice here, it's now letting me come in because it sees we're using a totally different application that's been set up for multi-factor auth. Notice there's her user account, but the thing that's different is that she's not granted this application access to her information yet. She hasn't consented. Once she consents by clicking accept, now we can see she is logging in from a totally different directory here, this CADF. It's no longer our C1AE. And we can see that it's coming from, that this is Megan that's logging in. So what did you see in this demo? You saw how to create an Azure AD application that was a single tenant application that only allowed people from the current tenant to log in and nobody else. And then you saw how to create a multi-tenant application that allowed anybody to be able to log in. And you can use either one of these depending on how you want to lock down your application. In this section, we're going to cover the different topology options available to developers that are supported by the Microsoft Identity Platform. These topologies include consumers, enterprises, business to business, and business to customer. Consumers refer to the Microsoft accounts that are created by users for personal use. The Microsoft account is a combination of the email address and a password that the user uses to sign in to all consumer-oriented Microsoft products and cloud services such as Outlook, OneDrive, MSDN, and Xbox Live. The Microsoft Identity Platform enables developers to create applications that allow users to sign in using either a Microsoft account, such as a personal account, or a work and school account, an Azure AD identity. While there are many similarities between Microsoft accounts and Azure AD accounts, Microsoft accounts are primarily for personal or consumer services. Some small businesses will also use consumer accounts and consumer services like email and OneDrive. Some similarities between the topologies include account and password management, support for multi-factor authentication, and passwordless authentication. Now, unlike Microsoft accounts, Azure AD accounts have additional security-related features that are available in enterprise scenarios. And as an app developer, you can use Microsoft accounts as a standards-based approach for adding single sign-on to your app, allowing it to work with a user's pre-existing credentials. Microsoft Identity also provides APIs that can help you build personalized app experiences using the user's personal Office 365 resources. Now, enterprises refer to Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD, Microsoft's cloud-based identity and access management service. Azure AD helps your employees sign in and access internal resources such as apps in your corporate network or intranet and cloud apps that are developed by your organization. In addition to internal resources, your employees can access external resources such as Microsoft Office 365 and many other SaaS-based applications. Now, as previously stated, Azure AD provides organizations and developers two important capabilities when it comes to building custom applications. Employee user accounts and groups are securely stored within an Azure AD directory. Employees can use these identities to sign in to the internal and external resources. IT administrators can also register applications with Azure AD that can be used in conjunction with software applications to control access and permissions to protected resources. As an app developer, you can use Azure AD as a standards-based approach for adding single sign-on (SSO) to your app, allowing it to work with a user's pre-existing credentials. Azure AD also provides APIs that can help you build personalized app experiences using existing organizational data. Azure Active Directory business-to-business, or B2B, collaboration lets you securely share your organization's applications and services with guest users from any organization while maintaining control over your own corporate data. Work safely and securely with external partners, large or small, even if they don't have Azure AD or an IT department. A simple invitation and redemption process lets partners use their own credentials to access your company's resources. Developers can use Azure AD business-to-business APIs to customize the invitation process or write applications like self-service sign-up portals. With Azure AD B2B, the partner uses their own identity management solution, so there's no external administrative overhead for your organization. The partner uses their own identities and credentials. Azure AD is not required. In addition, you don't need to manage external accounts or passwords, nor do you need to sync accounts or manage the lifecycle of accounts. Let's look at how an external user will access your resources in a B2B scenario. In this scenario, you are the Contoso organization, and Fabricam is a partner of yours. You have configured Azure AD B2B with Fabricam. So user B has been configured to work within the Contoso organization. A user from Fabricam needs to access content within the Contoso organization. Because the content is protected by Azure AD, the user will be redirected to Contoso to sign in for authentication and authorization to obtain an access token from Contoso that is required to access consent. Contoso's Azure AD recognizes that a user is a guest from Fabricam and is configured for B2B with Contoso. So Azure AD is going to redirect the user to Fabricam for sign-in. After the user signs in with Fabricam, they're redirected back to Contoso's Azure AD that validates the Fabricam generated token and creates a new token for the user to access the content. And because the new token was created by Contoso's Azure AD directory, it can then be used to access the content because it only trusts the Contoso Azure AD directory. Azure AD B2B provides IT administrators and developers multiple ways to grant users from another organization access to your corporate network. An administrator can create a new guest user in the Azure AD portal similar to how you would add a new user. They can be sent an email invitation or they can be added in bulk using PowerShell. Administrators can also delegate group owners and application owners manage their own guest user so that they can add users and guests directly to any application that they want to share. Now, once a guest user has been added to your directory, you can use Azure AD's conditional access policies, such as multi-factor auth, to further protect your content at the tenant level, application level, or for specific guest users. Azure Active Directory Business to Customer is a customer identity access management solution capable of supporting millions of users and billions of authentications per day. It takes care of the scaling and safety of authentication platform monitoring and automatically handles threats like denial of service, password spray, or brute force attacks. Azure AD B2C users uses standards-based authentication protocols including Azure AD Connect and OAuth 2.0. Now with Azure AD B2C, users will authenticate with their preferred identity provider that has been configured by you and your IT administrator. The user signs in using a customized sign-in page that's hosted by Azure AD B2C. Azure AD B2C is a white label authentication solution, which means that you can customize the entire user experience with your brand so that it blends seamlessly with your web and mobile applications. Customize every page displayed by Azure AD B2C when your user signs in, signs up, and modify their profile information. Customize the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in your user journeys so that the Azure AD B2C experience looks and feels like it's a native part of your application. Now, after the user signs in, you can implement progressive polling. Progressive polling allows your customers to quickly complete their first transaction by supplying only the minimum required information necessary. But over time, you can gradually collect more and more profile data from the customer each time they sign in. You can store up to 100 custom attributes per user in Azure AD B2C, or integrate with external systems to store even more details on your users. Both Azure AD B2B collaboration and Azure AD B2C allow you to work with external users in Azure AD. But how do they compare? Well, Azure AD B2B is really a business, is for businesses that want to securely share files and resources with external users so that they can collaborate. An Azure administrator can set up B2B in the Azure portal, and Azure AD takes care of the federation between your business and your external provider. Users can sign in to the shared resources using a simple invitation and redemption process with their work or school account or any email account. Azure AD B2C is primarily for businesses and developers that create customer-facing apps. Now with Azure AD B2C, developers can use Azure AD as the full-featured identity system for their application, and while letting customers sign in with an identity that they already have established, like Facebook or Gmail. Now, in this demo, we're going to show you something that's very similar to what you saw in demo number 2, except with one exception. The thing that's going to be different about this one is that in the demo you saw a minute ago, that was all about single tenant and multi-tenant organizations, and applications. But in this case here, what I want to show you is the business to business or the B2B aspect of Azure AD. And in this case, we're still going to create an application that should only allow users from the tenant where the current users are logged in. But I would optionally like to be able to add other users from outside, like partners or other customers, not customers, but I want to add partners to my organization to be able to sign in to this application. So what I'm going to do is I've done the same thing I did in the previous demo, which is just use the .NET SDK to create an MVC single org based application. But I do need to go in and set the configuration up for this guy. So let's come over here to Azure AD. And what I've done is I created a third application here called the Identity 03. Let's grab his values just like we did last time. So I'll grab the application ID and I'll paste him in. I grab the directory ID and I'll paste him in. And I'll grab the domain as well. And I will paste this in. And let's just make sure, save my changes, and let's just make sure that the launch settings are set up. Yep, 3007. And we still have all those same settings we did before. So if I come over here to our app registrations, he's still set up for single org based application. So you see here, I've got the same 3007 for the sign-ins. I have the sign out link. I have the ID token for the implicit grant, and we have it set to a single tenant. Now, another thing I want to show you, if I come over here to my Azure AD app and I go to a list of all of my users, I want you to notice there is nobody here named Megan Bowen. Okay, she's not listed here in my application. So if I come over here to our app, so let's come back over here to our application and let's run this. And do a .NET build, followed by a .NET restore or run. I'm going to show you two things. I'm first going to try, and we're going to go ahead and log in with this application the same way we did last time. But this time, we're going to repeat the same process. I just want you to see this again to hammer this home. So here we go. I've got the current user signed in. So this is the same user that is inside of the directory where the application's created. So again, the C1AE, we still want that to happen. And I also want you to notice too that there's the user. Now, just keep this in mind here. Couple claims here that I want you to pay attention to that are the way things are being listed here. Okay, so notice that they're still coming from the C1AE. Right, this is my directory from the Voitanos dev tenant. Now let's log out and let's try and sign in with Megan. Now, when I sign in with Megan, what should happen? We should see this fail. Right, this should not work. And the reason why this should not work again is because sign out. Try it again. There we go. Sign in as Megan, and I'll paste in Megan's password. We should get a failure, and the reason why is because she doesn't exist inside of this directory. But let me show you something. Let's back up. So here's the sign-in page. Let's just refresh. All right, now let's go invite Megan into our organization. So I'm going to do that by coming over here and saying a new guest user. I'm going to invite the user, and I'm going to invite Megan. So let me grab her email address, make sure I paste it in correctly. I'm going to invite Megan. Now, Megan would get an email invite from me saying you've been invited into the organization, and there she is right there. So she's invited user. Now notice this user, doesn't have a username and password inside of my organization. She's just invited as a guest. So in a B2B relationship, meaning that she can log in using her credentials and her identity information from the tenant where she's from, in this case here, M365. And when she goes to log in, that's going to be passed over to this directory, the Voitanos dev directory, which is going to trust that she has authenticated because it's an Azure AD. Azure AD trusts Azure AD. And I've granted this user access. So now, if I come over here and Megan tries to sign in, and we plug in her password, now the login is successful. It's just jumping straight to the directory or straight to the consent process. So here it's asking Voitanos dev wants access to these things. Do you grant it that information? So you should only accept it if you trust this organization. So I'll say accept it, but take a look at this. Let's go let it log in. So what it's doing right now is it's creating a service principal inside of my directory to log into this application. But check this out. So we can see that Megan is logged in. There's her name. There's a unique name. But check out some of this other information here that's interesting. Her identity provider, she is logging in from her directory, 7ADF. You may remember that from demo 2. That is her directory. That is coming from the M365 directory. But check out where her claims are coming from. It's coming from my directory. It's coming from the Voitanos dev directory. It's because that when she requested to sign in to my application, the request was sent to my directory. My directory recognized that she was a guest user, but she wasn't signed in. So it redirected her over to her directory where she signed in. It then sent her back over to my directory, which checked to see if she had granted those permissions. She hadn't yet, so it prompted for consent. And that's what let her log in, gave her a new credential, a new access token from my directory that all of my content was set up to trust. And so in this demo, you saw how to set up B2B using an invitation. That concludes this module on getting started with Microsoft Identity Platform. Thank you very much, and I hope you got a lot out of this.